Alright, so here we are in the designer mode, and today I'm going to be working on a new version of the Todd Howard. So, been doing a lot of work on the campaign, and been using the Todd Howard quite a lot, so I really wanted to use this design against the white flares. But we keep running into this issue where on imperfect terrain, we just end up flipping. So I need a design that's got a much better drag profile, and a better center of mass, and a better center of force thrust, whatever you want to call it, so that it actually stays balanced and stays on course. Now, initially, I thought I was going to stick with this idea of having this central puck sort of design in the center of the craft in order to use a turret to point directly at the enemy craft to keep it going there. So I start by making the puck a little bit heavier, replacing parts of it with metal for armor, and then replacing parts that aren't on the front with lead to make that heavier, hopefully dragging the center of mass a little bit further backwards. And then I decide that I'm going to shrink it down from being a 3x3 one-axis turret to being a 1x1. So that way I can get increased battery power, because I also noticed that the Todd Howard was not quite fast enough. So after redesigning this, I go ahead and save it as the next version. Now from here, I want to implement a couple of things. So I want it, right now it tops out at about 56 meters a second, and I really want it to get up to at least 65. Right now it can't really chase anything down, and I think that 65 is going to be the slowest I should accept the new version to be. Ideally, it gets up over 70, well over 70. That's probably where you want a ramming craft. The faster, the better. But that's the target. The target is to get up to at least 65. Now, when I initially made the Todd Howard, and a lot of my vehicle craft actually, I didn't know how the roll bars worked. I kind of saw them there, and I honestly figured that they were just cosmetic. I never fiddled around with them enough to realize what they actually did. And they're actually very strong. So they add force to a wheel based on the roll of the craft. And they don't need a PID, they don't need control inputs. They just know what they're supposed to do by default. So we end up switching that, using the roll bars rather, to maintain the roll of the craft. Now we're still going with the puck idea, and then over here we're just working on the front ram. Now all in all, the Todd Howard, HMCS Todd Howard, which I'm going to refer from this point as the Mark II, had approximately 18 revolving blast guns. This new one ends up with, I believe, 28. So it starts out with 21, but then I add a fourth row and gets all the way up to 28. So yeah, then we're going to go through it, and we're going to change the required accuracy of these up to 45 degrees. So the reason for this is I might use the local weapon controller, I might use an ACB. If I end up using a local weapon controller, the revolving blast guns have a very narrow cone that they can actually aim in. So I need to set it so that they're not picky with their accuracy, so that they will just fire. Ultimately, they're a shotgun with like a 45-degree spread almost. Well, it's more like 35 somewhere in there, but they're a shotgun. They don't need to point directly at something. So from here on, I start doing a couple tests just to check out the mobility and see if I can get some rubber onto this, because I don't want it to just explode if it's on uneven ground. I need it to be able to handle some different terrain, and that includes, you know, minor bumps of the terrain. If it gets knocked off balance, or explosions happen, or the terrain's not flat, I need to know that it can bounce off the ground. So I add a little bit of rubber there. Then we cap that off, and we add a couple more wheels, which of course don't like to sit perfectly. And we set up the tracks. And I noticed that this doesn't actually increase our speed at all, having the tracks placed up higher. I figured it would, because I've seen that on quite a few designs. So I end up changing it around over to this. And this definitely increases our speed. So I'm quite happy with that. Now, I do know that there's basically a speed limit on the wheels, so we are going to need to use jets in order to exceed that speed limit. So I guess the idea is going to be to turn down the power on the wheels and just sort of use them as the baseline, and then put most of our power into the rear jets. And that gives us quite a bit of speed. Now we are using all of our engine power, so I think we ought to reallocate some of that resource, but I'm also not quite happy. I mean, 1800 engine power, that's a lot, but it's not a tremendous amount. We did hit that 65 meters, actually we top up to 68 on a turn, but it's just not sustained, and that's with rapid loss in our total engine power. So we're going to need to redo our engines, and we've increased our ammo requirements, so we're going to want to expand that ammo thing. So after fiddling around with this turret idea with wheels on it for a little while, I end up deciding that it's probably just not going to work. So we take the whole turret as a prefab, and we go through a couple of attempts trying to paste it onto the main body before we end up giving up and improvising something. From here, we end up taking apart all of the excess. So because we ended up increasing the number of turrets, we need a lot more ammo, and because we have a heavier craft in general, we're going to need more engine power, especially if we want it to go very fast. So I start by just taking away all the internals that we don't need, and then saving a prefab of the AI and going ahead and stripping everything else off. From here, we're going to start adding things back the way we need them on the other side of the craft. And then we're going to start working on thrust balancing. So a little while later, we have gotten a little bit more structure in place, and I'm going to use a pleat to cover up the underside of this and sort of I'm trying to make this thing actually aerodynamic so that with all of its thrust and its power, if it does get airborne, it's actually somewhat stable as like a projectile almost. I know that sounds weird, but that is the goal. We are going to be using a pleat to armor up the underside. I know it's not ideal. However, this thing is meant to go fast, and it's kind of meant to be a throwaway vehicle. I'm just editing the backside here for some proper placement of thrusters. But yeah, because this thing is meant to be fast and a throwaway vehicle, I want it to be heavy, which is part of the reason we have heavy armor, and I want it to be able to take a shot of whatever fires at it, which is the reason it's made out of heavy armor. Lead is simply not very durable, and anything made out of lead would explode when it was... Yeah, well, anything made out of lead dies when it's killed, obviously. So yes, we avoid using lead for the time being. We end up covering the whole thing in an outer layer of a pleat, giving us a pretty nice space for internals down here. Taking a quick look at exactly how much engine power we're going to be able to have here, I see a nice 6,500 already, and that's not even with the space used very well. So we take a small little adjustment here, and we end up with 7,500. We'll come back to that later, adding the small point to control the craft, but for now, that's a good placeholder. Other than that, I want to make this look kind of good. So we're going to go over here. We're going to fiddle with the pleat to make sure that we get the biggest pieces possible to cover the same area, because that is the best way to maximize the cost here. And then we're going to go ahead and do the same thing on the other side, trying our best to basically mirror the drag profile. Now, I mentioned I want this thing to be stable, and I'm going through a lot of effort to try and mirror the drag profile so that it is as smooth as possible. I want this thing to... I want to minimize the variation in its pathing, essentially. The more stable I can get this, the better it will handle at high speeds. So we really don't want it to behave too awkwardly. So to me, it's very important that it's stable. I also don't like how far forward the center of mass is, so I replaced some of those pieces of heavy armor with full beams of lead just to drive the center of mass back a little bit. I then realized that I have an extra space in here that I could add another line of revolving blast guns, and I end up doing that, which brings us to a total of 28 revolving blast guns, which is a ridiculous amount of firepower. At the back, we end up filling this in with lead to further move the center of mass back where we want it. After that, we end up doing some fiddling around in here. We add ourselves a small cockpit, reduce our engine power just a little bit, But honestly, I think that's okay. I'd rather be able to drive this vehicle manually than have a little bit more engine power. And we used to have 1800 engine power. The preliminary test of this clocks in at 114 meters a second and doesn't even use all of the engine power that we currently have, which I am very pleased with. I'm also going to go into the tracks and set them to be turning presets so that hopefully they'll increase our ability to turn. And I've actually been using a little bit this new, well, I don't know how new it is, but the automatic thrust assignment is really good. I don't know. I just used it for the yaw on these thrusters as well. And I have to say, this thing can turn even without anything extra specifically dedicated for it. Anyway, after taking a look at my ammo, I realized I need some more ammo. So we had some more ammo, and then we go over to fiddle with the AI. I don't really know exactly what needs tuned yet. We'll have to see it in action before I can mess with too much. I am going to add a PID for the yaw so that hopefully it has smoother movement. Because I don't know how well it moves, I'm going to set it to invincible and test it out against a couple different things. What I notice here is that the thing is overestimating its ability to turn. But whoa! Okay, I forgot about that. Yeah, it's got a lot of thrust. Apparently it has enough to lift the mule airborne, but it's definitely trying to turn a lot closer than it can. And I honestly considered changing this to an AI that has the ability to pathfind based on its current forward, rather than its current position, which I think I'm using ship or tank, and I think you'd have to use either hover or airplane for that one. Now, here we see a pretty exaggerated waggle back and forth from the left to the right, which means that either the derivative time on the PID is too high or the gain is too high. Turns out it was the gain. Now, I will end up turning the thrust on this down just a little bit, simply because it will have to take some long drawn-out fights, and there's no guarantee I'll be able to sit it at 1.2 million battery. When batteries are repaired and initially loaded in, they do not start at full power. So that is a lot of energy being stored in this thing. It's also got to be said, the amount of power this thing has is pretty intense, and I've got to say I'm pretty happy with this thing's drag profile. It seems fairly stable even when it takes off, so you may have noticed that it lifted up that mule over there. It may not have landed right side up, but the important thing is it didn't land in such a way that it would destroy itself, which is really big, and it also didn't lose control despite how much thrust it had when it flew away. Oh my god, my ear. I'm just doing a weapons test because they didn't fire the first time. Now from here, I'm not entirely sure what I need to improve on this craft. Something in its reliability to actually connect with targets. This is always the hardest part about making a melee craft, and it's generally why I don't make melee craft, but I start fiddling with the yaw control and telling the AI what its turning circle is, and I also start just paying attention to how this thing moves when it flies. So those wheels and those rams don't take ramming damage. So no matter how hard you land on a wheel, your craft isn't going to implode like it would if you landed on your armor. And because those actually end up taking up all of our front and all of our sides, and because the drag profile is pretty consistent, this thing actually has a really low chance of destroying itself in a crash. I have to say, it also has so much thrust that even with no spin blocks or piston shenanigans, it's more than capable of just brute forcing its way through something like a dull blade, which I kind of like. All things considered, there's plenty of craft where oh my god, that aerial takedown! I just suplexed a tank, and now I'm driving upside down. Oh man. Todd Howard can suplex a tank. That's a new one. That is a new one. I go about fiddling around with some of the roll bars, seeing what happens if I crank their force all the way up. I find it really useful to test stuff like that simply because when you push things to their extremes, what's really different about them ends up showing itself. This final test was because I did end up altering the PID as well as some control things on the last one, and we got a solid hit damn near center of mass. Now, it's got to be said, the Todd Howard Mark II was about 18,000 materials, so this one is coming in at about 33,000. It is substantially more expensive, which is not ideal, and it's also not very pretty. I'm not overly happy with the overall aesthetic of this particular build. We end up adding some rams to the side here just to round it out, make it feel a little bit more complete. And I do a couple more tests just watching how it handles when it does lose control. And I gotta say, this thing generally lands on its feet, and I'm pretty happy about that. It usually lands intact, and every once in a while it lands upside down, but for the most part, this is the sort of thing where I'd be able to turn the AI off, let it get stable, and then turn it back on again, and then it should be able to go in for another ram. Even when it does accidentally smash part of its face on the ground, it doesn't completely lose it, because it's a pretty glancing melee. And for the most part, all the rams stay intact and all the revolving blast guns stay intact. So, theoretically, this thing should be a substantial upgrade. All in all, the vehicle that we ended up with ends up going almost twice as fast, has almost twice as much firepower, and costs almost twice as much. But I gotta say, it does almost twice as much damage, and it hits almost all the time. So I think before I was sending about 6 of the Mark IIs against craft and getting maybe 1 or 2 connections, and this, I'm a lot more confident that even on imperfect terrain, I'm gonna get more reliable connections with twice the payload. So I can't wait to use this. Alright, so a little while later, after some tweaking, a little bit more, we're going to test this not on high speed against this. Oh, man. Oh, beautiful! That is an outright one-shot. It's not on God mode. It handled the terrain. It hit dead center. It fired when it was supposed to, and it one-shot that whole vehicle. Oh my god, it just works, ladies and gentlemen. Alright, so we've got a Rapture spawned in, and we're going to load in another one of these Todd Howards. Now, I've been testing this for a while. We are very slowed down, and I think I've finally found the change that, you know what, instead of this having a derivative time, I really just need it to work something like this. So we're gonna see if that ends up connecting. Now, the problem I keep having, if we can get this to go back up to normal speed, there we go. The problem I keep having is that whenever it gets right within melee range, it's just pulling really hard, turning in one direction or the other. Now, collision avoidance is off, so the only reason it's doing this is simply because I don't have the derivative time set correctly. But I think this 0.2 seconds derivative time should just about fix the problem. And there we go. It actually died to the first shot. The rest of those shotgun blasts were completely unnecessary. Wow. Todd, you are frightening. If you like this video or From the Depths content, you want to see more like it, then like, shares, comments, subscribe, so on and so forth. And as an aside, we got the sub goal. If we hit 100 subs by the end of this Ashes of the Empire series, I'll be publishing all of my blueprints up on the Steam Workshop. I've been Sicargo, and this has been fun, and I'll see y'all next time with some more From the Depths.